hello, very beautiful community. Let's ground ourselves. We're going to be here for a while. And we're going to be engaged in a slightly narcissistic but also anti-narcissistic activity. Tongue-in-cheek, I say slightly narcissistic because we will not be focusing on the people of Gaza or on Israel. We'll be focusing on ourselves. Westerners who have tried and often failed, especially when it comes to how we've negotiated it in our information environment, to ethically and epistemically process what happened. Ethically and epistemically, the West's processing of this has been a disaster, which we'll try to reflect upon, address, and in a very minimal way unravel in this long conversation, which I'll conduct via a series of basic questions to which we need to give answers that are not in the first instance analytical, but are about a kind of a balancing of our economy of ethical sentiment and a balancing of our perspective of political orientation. In 2023, I tried to make maybe half a dozen videos addressing the situation. And the reason I went on with them is that because something was already going really wrong with the distinction between targeting combatants and targeting non-combatants, that a lot of the liberal, centrist, center-left commentariat were not catching on to yet. Now, when it comes to war, the central ethical distinction is between jus ad bellum and jus in bello, the justice of the initiation of the war and the justice of the prosecution of the war. And this is an historical occasion, one of many in human history, in which the question of the justice of the prosecution of the war simply ate up the conversation about the justice of the initiation of the war, because eventually the war, via a series of disinhibiting steps, became a war on civilians. In the videos in 2023, I made clear that what was going wrong was that Israel was ceasing to try to not target non-combatants. Because it's one thing to say I'm targeting only combatants, but it's another thing to say I'm targeting combatants and trying to not target non-combatants. If you're targeting only combatants but doing nothing to try to not target non-combatants, you are beginning a road, the terminus of which is a war on the civilian population. There are more steps in that progression. We'll actually address ourselves to them, but that was a problem. And what was happening with a lot of the commentators that I myself admire and widely recommend is that when we were saying this, they were still publishing articles saying it's important that Israel complies with international law in its response to the barbarism of October 7th. This was inadvertently a form of gaslighting. Sometimes it was very innocent because it actually takes a little time to get an article out. And so if an article is out a few weeks after you've written it, then you can be in trouble that way because the world's moved on. But that wasn't the case all the time. There was a bit of a micro industry of just in a robotic way saying, yes, October 7th is absolutely catastrophic. Yes, Israel has a right to defend itself. And now it's very important, even though it's not looking very good, it's very important that Israel complies with international law. Why was this gaslighting? It was gaslighting because if you are 19 and you are Sandra and you are a student in modern history at the University of Freiburg and you're sitting in a square in the city and you're reading one of these articles while having a cappuccino, what you need as an ethical guidance from this 60, 70, 80-year-old public intellectual you're reading is absent. Because you already know Israel is not complying with international law, and you need to be helped You need language that helps you capture what it is that Israel is doing and how bad or not bad it is. That guidance is completely missing with the generic evasive thing. Well, it should be, emphasize that Israel needs to comply with international law. It's a bit like me turning up with a giant bottle of lemonade to a party with a hole in it. And people saying, well, it's very important that we don't spill any of the lemonade. That's a great thing to say, but once you recognize that there's a hole in it, you're dealing with a different reality, and saying that no longer works. So we're going to proceed in sections, and in this next little section, what I want to do is say a few procedural things to ground us for this conversation, because in the minority of us, this topic brings out our worst sides. Let's now do a little bit of procedural grounding, starting with you and then coming to this side, the side of the pulls and pushes acting upon creators whose content you watch or read. On your side, I am not so interested in what you think. I'm interested in how what you think sits in you and how what you think moves. If I can make a contribution to that in some way with this session, I'm happy. I'm not interested that you agree or disagree with me. Second part about you. A minority of you are going to have elicited your worst side by this conversation. And that means that a tiny fraction of you will leave toxic, racist, spammy, unconstructive comments, and probably 2 or 3 of you during the course of this session will lose your commenting rights. If you lose your commenting rights in a moment of heat and you want them back, drop an email to get in touch with Vlad with one sentence: I got overheated, I want back, and you'll be likely reinstated. Now, what's important to understand procedurally here is that there is a difference between the comment section and the general reaction of the people who watch. Okay? So when a video goes down well with pretty much everybody, the likes ratio is about 99% on the chat channel for me. That's what the average likes ratio is behind the scenes on most chats. But when a video goes down badly, and it feels like every third comment is negative, the actual likes ratio only goes down to about 96 or 95%. So the comment section is not representative of the cumulative experience of the audience watching, okay? Now let's turn this around this way. There are 2 paths that are worth being transparent about for our benefit today, beautiful community. The first is just that while this is not the most toxic topic to talk about, it's in the top 3. And that means that when you talk about it, you get backlash and a certain degree of threats coming in on various platforms and messengers. My advice to people who are impacted by this is, well, then just don't go there. Don't talk about XYZ. I remember talking to a big channel sometime in 2024 who got burned by talking about Israel-Palestine and had a serious mental health impact. And my advice is, if that's how it impacts you, put up buffers, don't go there. Bottom line, that's all one can say. Now, I don't get impacted like that at all, but it's important that you understand that for the purpose of incentive transparency. The second line is around views and finance. And here there is the opportunity cost, upside you leave on the table, and then there is sort of realized loss, downside. So let's take an example. I keep ads to a minimum on the chat channel. There are no non-skippable ads and no ads of any kind in the middle of my videos. I also don't take sponsorships for ethical reasons. And so this channel brings in over 20x less than some other channels in the niche. And on a given day, I'm going to spend 2 or 3 times more on takeaway than I'm going to earn from the chat channel directly. What is that gap? That gap is, if I said X, Y, Z, then there'd be an increase in views and financial benefit. What's a classic example of that? Putin is going to collapse next Tuesday. Putin's regime is going to collapse next Tuesday. And you might think, well, are we really that dumb? Are you serious that sort of 70% of people fall for that year after year after year after year? And the answer is yes, but with a qualification. People, to be sentimental for a moment, contain multitudes within them. And just like you might like a sophisticated meal, so you also like candy. And YouTube is very good, but is actually more responsible than probably any other platform I can think of, but it's still very good at exploiting your propensity to be drawn to candy. And it's not that everybody jumps on the Putin's gonna collapse video because they are stupid. It's because that's the candy side of their economy of motivation that's appealed to. There are other sides to appeal to, but they're more complex and they're much harder to appeal to in this informational environment. So it's not that people are dumb, it's that just one side, the candy side of you, is being, if you like, manipulated, and you are drawn to consume in a particular direction as a result. Then there is the loss the other way, which is not if I say X, views will go up and income will go up. It's if I say X, income will go down and views maybe too, or maybe not. Now, when I discussed Trump's catastrophic invasion of Iran, my criticisms of Israel had an impact on Patreon, where a lot of people support my work. And that probably took out maybe a recurrent contribution worth a month's income. This video will probably do the same. This is normal. This is normal. But you also have to understand that it's only a minority of creators who are not going to be lost in the waves of that. So it's important to be transparent about the incentive structures that sort of, apply pushes and pulls to the people who you might be watching or reading. Okay, enough. Let's get to the topic at hand. So our first question is, why did so many people in the West, including in the universities in the West, fail to condemn as barbaric the actions of Hamas on October 7th and construed them either as liberatory or partly liberatory, or at least inevitable or morally neutral, or not up for moral evaluation one way or another because they are a desperate defensive gesture or something like that. You might think that anti-Semitism is top of the list. It isn't. It's not one of the 3 main reasons, but it plays a role. And we're going to talk about it later because, as we've mentioned, we've got a rise of anti-Semitism, just like we've got a rise of Islamophobia. But here are, I think, the 3 main reasons why so many in the West failed to condemn Hamas. Number 1 is the thought that this is the only political vehicle that the people of Gaza have. So no matter how destructive it is, it's all they've got, and therefore I can still conceive of it as a kind of anti-colonial liberatory enterprise. Now, how can you possibly see what happened on October 7th as liberatory? Because it is both appallingly counterproductive for all parties involved, and it is palpably a certain kind of outbreak of modern barbarism. And I think that you get there via seeing Hamas as the only game in town, with the added background of the shadow of postmodernism and post-structuralism, which you often get in the universities, which makes you conceive of a disempowered group and the political projects associated with it in terms that are beyond good and evil. There are just power relations, there are people on the wrong end of the power relations, and there can't be ethical evaluation of what they do. The second reason is what I would call the Yanis Varoufakis reason. Close to October 7th, Yanis was asked, will you condemn it? And he famously, in a clip that went viral, said, I don't remember the words verbatim, so I'll be precautionarily generous to him. He said, it's absolutely horrific and terrible and destructive, but I'm not going to condemn it, because there is an element of inevitability to it, in the sense of, if you create conditions A, B, C, D, E, and then F happens, what can you say about it? What can you expect, right? A good number of people in mainstream journalistic institutions feel this as well. It's the psychology of a kind of exasperation with Israel. This is not a psychology that attributes any liberatory credentials to what Hamas did, but it attributes a kind of, what can you possibly expect, account to the situation. Then I think there is a third reason, and the third reason says, look, Israel's project against the people of Gaza is so existential and so genocidal, or something else of that kind, that you can't ethically evaluate resistance. All three reasons simply evacuate Hamas agency from the equation, and that's absurd, right? You have to give Hamas agency here. Just like you have to give Hamas agency when Israel does bad things in Gaza that Hamas wanted Israel to do. So there's a kind of strange ethnocentric compliment that it's possible to pay Israel here, whereby the actions of Israel are real, but the actions of Hamas are not. And that's a funny kind of collapse into racism, actually. So you've got to make sure that you have an adult, grown-up account of the agency and the moral culpability of Hamas. Even if you make the case that a certain disastrous action is made more likely by particular circumstances that in a morally culpable way state put into place, that's a level of explanation that can't possibly eat up the level of explanation of what the people who did what they did on October 7th were doing. And it's possible that something can be your only political vehicle, the only political game you've got in town, but it's also possible that that game is murderous, terroristic, and even for you completely counterproductive. So let's now move to problems of condemning Israel's response. So why did so many also fail to properly condemn Israel? Here I see more than 10 different reasons, And I'm only going to name a few, and I'm not going to rank them. Some are obvious, and I won't dwell on them. So one is that Israel is seen by Western centers of power as a strategic ally, and that tends to dissolve the deleterious moral consequences of things Israel might get up to. A second reason is the conflation of the vulnerability and precarity of Jews with the vulnerability and precarity of the state of Israel. Another reason I'm going to put on the table is a kind of canonization and departicularization of the Holocaust. So what is the Holocaust? The Holocaust is a human group doing terrible things to some other human groups, and then a history of what happens afterwards to the perpetrators and to the victim groups. But there is a certain way of canonizing the Holocaust whereby you simply freeze your perspective of the victim group, and the question becomes unavailable to you. It is a question we'll get to a little bit later today, of what is the relations of Israel's current actions with the question of what it means to remain in an ethically adequate relationship with the Holocaust. So, because the Holocaust is seen as a certain kind of symbol in Western civilization, it becomes difficult to raise questions about the status of the groups involved as it has evolved over time. And this is why, for instance, you have German politics generating tendencies like, let's respect international law, but let's not apply it to Israel, because applying it to Israel would violate a certain kind of symbolic core of Western civilization self-conception. I'm going to put one more reason on the table, and that's racism. And it's easier for us actually to see it because there's an enormous amount of racism toward the Palestinians among oppositional Russians and Ukrainians. There's plenty of Ukrainians who get it, and probably better than oppositional Russians, but there is a problem there. There's an enormous degree of racism there. Really on the part of anybody who's come out of the Soviet bloc. And that's a problem, because this goes together with a certain kind of dichotomy where there is the civilized world and then there is a kind of barbarism, and Germany and Ukraine are on the side of the civilized world together with Israel. And then Palestinians are on the other side, perhaps together with Russians. And that's a huge problem. That's a huge problem, particularly among certain ex-Soviet bloc folks. But of course, we also have it here in the West. So there's this kind of truth that, of course, even though we haven't supported Ukrainians enough, we have supported Ukrainians as much as we have supported them, because they look much more like us than Palestinians do. Let's now jump to a series of almost yes or no questions and speed our conversation up a little bit. So the first question is, was a military response by Israel justified or necessary? Necessary, no. inevitable nearly, justified yes. In response to October 7th, Israel was justified to respond in a way that also generated innocent and civilian casualties in Gaza, so long as those were proportionate and secondary to a strategy with an idea of a post-war, post-military operation political solution that entailed some version of commitment to mutual coexistence. So clearly the answer is, in principle, justified yes. Is the devastation in Gaza part of Hamas's design and the trap they set for Israel? Yes. What is the principle that Israel needed to use to react proportionately to that trap? I don't think there is a single principle. There might be several, so let's try to name one or two. The most important one is the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. And via a series of political and institutional slippery slopes, fueled by a degree of partly theatrical and partly intentional genocidal language by certain Israeli officials, what happened is that very rapidly the institutionalized intent to avoid targeting civilians, non-combatants, non-combatants, evaporated. That became palpable early on. However, things went further, and an enterprise that lost interest in avoiding targeting non-combatants went even further and became essentially a war on the non-combatant population of Gaza. So the collapse of the combatant-non-combatant distinction is combatant-non-combatant distinction is central. Second, the violence Israel engaged in needed to be secondary to a strategy. I do not recognize a strategy there at all, except for a strategically coherent picture Netanyahu might have in his head that one of his reasons for war is regime security because it helps him keep power. So the combatant-non-combatant distinction was obliterated. There was no strategy here, and there was no readiness to transfer out of violence into the pursuit of political methods of weakening Hamas, when such opportunities were available and were more effective or less ineffective than the perpetuation of organized violence. Let's now ask ourselves a few short questions about siege and the ethics of sieges. So our two questions about siege ethics are: what responsibility do you have to people that you have ensconced in a siege? And are there circumstances under which these responsibilities can be suspended? And did these circumstances apply in the case of Israel and Gaza? Now, we'll just do a placeholder in answer to the first question. Your responsibilities are to ensure the basic sustenance of the population under siege, including their dietary and their medical needs. Under what circumstances can you suspend this responsibility? That seems to me to require two conditions. First, that the war is sufficiently existential for you. And two, that there is a causal relationship between the population under siege and their political and military leadership, such that you are implementing a siege for existential reasons under circumstances in which the population under siege will then put pressure on their political rulers, and they will then change course. Did this condition obtain in the case of Israel and Gaza? No. There was no such causal connection between the people of Gaza and their political leadership. Moreover, Hamas actually benefited from a deterioration of the situation for civilians in Gaza. Was the Israeli leadership aware that that was the case, that there was an absence of this causal connection, as I think the a wonderful philosopher Michael Walzer argued? Yeah, they knew. So they knew that the only conditions under which you can suspend your responsibilities to a population under siege did not apply. So let's now move to a question about the Israeli hostages. Of course, the main responsibility for the hostages is with Hamas. But when Hamas took the hostages, Israel inherited a responsibility for its own citizens who were taken. What can we say in broad brushstrokes about that responsibility? What Israel owed the hostages is a limited war and the conversion of the war into a political fight against Hamas. Once such a possibility was A, available, and B, likely to maximize the survival and return of the hostages. So the criticism made by wonderful just war philosopher Michael Walzer is that Israel subordinated the interests of the hostages to the pursuit of a strategy-less total war, to the pursuit of Benjamin Netanyahu's regime security needs, and to the pursuit of the avoidance of accepting a need for qualified coexistence after the war. So I'm not going to fill this out, but that's roughly the structure. If an opportunity arises to maximize hostage return by converting from military to political process, and that's not done, then that's an ethical failure of the hostages, but I'm not going to fill that in. So let's now take a few brief questions, then we can do genocide, then we can do adequacy to the Holocaust, and then we can talk about anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel. So does Israel have a right to exist? This is a question that's gained a manipulative history in our information environment, but it doesn't make the question improper. You might think, well, we don't talk about Germany or France having a right to exist, but that's only because there is no political project putting their right to exist in question. if there were, then we would be talking about the right of Germany or France to exist. So there is nothing problematic about that, and I recommend the view that Israel absolutely has a right to exist. What if you try to leverage the ghastliness of what took place during the formation of the State of Israel as a reason to delegitimate it? And there you'd run into the problem that these are common features of the formations of many states. You can't get from that history to the claim that Israel doesn't have a right to exist in 2026. It does. Does Israel have a right to exist as a Jewish state? Well, in a banal sense, as a sovereign state for the Jews, sure, yeah. In the sense that has now come to the fore, the sense of a Jewish state as a special kind of ideological project, no. In other words, it would be highly irrational for Palestinians to recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state in that richer ideological sense, because that would effectively mean them saying that they're giving the green light for their people to be mistreated on territories Israel controls. So in that richer ideological sense, where you're talking about something expansionist, something in which Palestinian folks are to prioritize, in that richer sense of an ideological project, the answer is no. And that's why Israel's leading philosopher Avishai Margalit says that Israel quite certainly has a right to exist, but doesn't have a right to exist as a Jewish state in this richer sense. Is Israel a democracy? Yeah, Israel is a democracy within the 1967 Green Line. It's quite a fragile democracy in the sense that it's got a dense democratic culture, but it's got fairly weak institutional checks and balances. You don't have to knock out many institutions to put an end to Israel's democracy. So it's an institutionally more vulnerable democracy than democracies in countries with very, very complex institutional ecosystems. What's the status of Israel's conduct outside of the 67 Green Line? Well, here I again agree with lots of Israelis. I agree with Avishai Margalit, with Henri Baum, a philosopher of the younger generation, who would say that this is a case of colonial rule, military occupation, and apartheid. It's a word I would use, but I'm open to you using your own word. But what we're talking about here is one political order with two populations treated with radical and systematic disparity when it comes to their rights to move about, their rights to work, their rights to get health and education services and so on. But when you apply tags like that, the question is, what political purpose does that tag serve? And if it serves a good political purpose, then it's good. If something else serves a better political purpose, then that's going to be better. And that's quite a good setup for us to get into what is going to be the biggest question of the day for us, and that is whether Israel committed genocide in Gaza. So let's do this, beautiful community. First of all, let me start by being incredibly mean to you. We live in a culture that exploits the concept of genocide and has a very trashy relationship with it in the informational space. There's plenty of hyper-identity politics co-option. This is a trend that's on the way down, but it's still there. And that means you say, it's big part of my identity that I think that this is genocide and that's not. That's not healthy. It might be healthy to think that it's a big part of your identity that you recognize that these horrors you are seeing are horrors of a particular kind or of a particular scale. But you really shouldn't incorporate the conceptualization of human horrors into a sense of your identity. That's toxic. And if anything, I encourage you to develop the muscle that allows you to capture the ethical and political awfulness of a particular thing happening, and then only secondarily go on to apply particular concepts to it. Of course, we have a huge problem with concept creep, and it's a problem we also have in other domains like human rights, and it's worth saying a little bit about that. There's a real paradox in the charity sector, for instance, about whether you call something a human rights problem. And the paradox is this: if we stick the human rights tag onto this situation, we might save a few extra kids with TB. So screw it, stick it in, stick it on. But if everybody goes around doing that, then we cumulatively deflate the value of the concept of human rights and bring about a situation where when people use it, it's a kneeling, meaningless enterprise. And that's a paradox. What advice do I give to people if they come to consult with me about a dilemma like that? I usually say, go ahead, stick it on. Go ahead, stick it on. Does it undermine the cumulative economy of discourse? Does it undermine the power of the concept? Yeah. Does that lead to devastation and loss of life in of itself too? Yeah. But everywhere you choose, you lose here. And you've got a particular situation where there are very tangible harms that you might prevent, right? So if using that term is the difference between you squeezing a 15 million versus you squeezing a 30 million bit of funding from your government for some important bit of overseas aid, yeah, use it for goodness sake. But there are big downsides to that. These are the paradoxes that folks live with, and I've been thinking systematically about human rights for almost 30 years, and genocide too. And these are the paradoxes we live with. The way into this conversation, I think, can be this for us. We're going to do something a bit neutral. In other words, this is something that I would impose even if I were dealing with an undergrad student or somebody writing a postgrad dissertation. And then I'm going to move on to giving if you like, a fully involved, prejudiced perspective about how I think we should construct the concept of genocide. But the next two things I want to say, which are the two most important things for you to understand about genocide, are going to be sufficiently neutral that you're just stuck with them. I don't care what view of genocide you take, you're going to be stuck with the next two things I say. And the fact that this will sound new to you, that some of it will sound new to you, will also be a good reminder to how impoverished your own understanding is of what might be the place in our culture of this concept. So also gain this perspective, right? Don't be a toddler who has barely learned how to walk, giving lectures on the internet to everybody about how to climb mountains. A little bit of perspective. There are going to be mountain climbing lessons in the comments from toddlers who can't walk. You can enjoy them, and there's nothing illegal about them, but they're not great for your self-development. So the first thing you've got to understand about genocide is that, like other concepts, like the concept of human rights, it needs to be constructed. It isn't just given. That means you can't say, oh, you want to know my view of genocide? It's the convention. It's the Genocide Convention. You can read it. And that's my concept of genocide. No, you can't do that. The concept needs to be constructed. It means you're welcome to wheel out the Genocide Convention, but it's not a substitute for justifying a particular construction of the concept. All you are saying is there are 17 different ways to construct the concept of genocide. I am wheeling out the Genocide Convention as the construction I prefer, and I'm going to justify it, because you still need to justify it. The person who wheels out the Genocide Convention doesn't need to justify themselves any less than the person who wheels out a construction that is very different to the Genocide Convention. Right? The concept needs to be constructed. There is nothing you can point to, right? Nothing you can stick on a post on Twitter and say, yeah, got you, this is the convention. This is what this is. No, you're not for, right? There's nothing you can do to outsource this. You're stuck. The construction of the concept of genocide is something we can't get out of. And every time we use the term, we are inevitably leaning on a particular and very contested construction of the concept. So no, you can't say, boom, the convention, and now I'm covered. Just like you can't say MSF or the Red Cross say X, therefore X. No. Whether your construction overlaps with theirs, either way, you need to justify it. Okay? That's the first thing. The second thing, and this is going to be strange, pulls in the opposite direction. So the second thing you've got to understand about genocide is that you cannot wish the Genocide Convention away. It's already part of our political discourse. It's already part in a very small and fragile way of our jurisprudential reality. And it's even inflected our culture in the way it's played a role in the post-World War II revolution in international jurisprudential norms. But wait, didn't you just mean on us and say that we needed the construction, and now you're saying that we have to some extent just accept the Genocide Convention? I mean, have you gone completely potty? What's going on? How do you square the two? So the first point is that the concept needs to be constructed. The second point is that however you construct the concept, you're still going to be reckoning with the fact that your construction will be a political usage, a cultural usage, but it is not likely to, in jurisprudential terms, replace the convention. We've got either the convention or nothing there. So, to some degree, the convention is simply there, and it has a particular impact on our practice and a particular impact on how we think of the term. To simply want to destroy it or wish it away or eliminate it would be difficult to justify in the world in which we want to preserve every kind of institutional layer we possibly have, because they're all melting before our eyes, because we've got democratic decline in our domestic politics. So the trouble we've landed in here is that we are a culture doomed to living with two lanes of conceptualization of genocide. We're doomed to living with two concepts of genocide. The concept that we construct and contest with one another independently of the convention, and the convention's elaboration of the concept. The only way they can bridge is if you make the case that the convention anyway happens to be a possible and an optimal way for us here and now to elaborate the concept of genocide. So we are doomed to this double-mindedness unless there is that convergence. So now let me put aside this neutral presentation and more firmly express my own views. What is the guiding concern of the construction of the concept of genocide? The guiding concern is that the way we construct the concept makes us slightly better at stopping and talking about stopping effectively, constructively, human beings doing the worst things human beings do to one another in politics. Less of that is the concern of the construction of the concept. Now, lots of things might fit within that. One would be what we've already implied, a kind of normative generosity toward the convention's construction, even if you think it's bad, because we're just partly stuck with it. It also means normative generosity toward the conceptualization of other human evils. Everything is what it is. A massacre is not ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing is not genocide. If it's all one porridge for you, you might as well not use any of these terms. There needs to be a preoccupation with extremity there. Genocide does not necessarily have to be the worst thing human beings do, because arguably starting a global nuclear exchange when there is no reason to is worse, because you could be killing hundreds of millions of people and ending human civilization. But genocide has got to be one of the worst things. If there is a genocide and it is nowhere near being one of the worst things happening anywhere in the world, then we've got a problem. So we need this normative generosity toward other conceptualizations of human evils, normative generosity toward the convention, and the readiness for this kind of double-minded coexistence of two concepts of genocide in our culture, one a more jurisprudential political one, and one a more political cultural one. We probably need a degree of binariness, right? We don't want a conception of genocide that is nearly impossible for reasonable people to apply. Is this it? Is this not? Well, just depends. Now, I am going to give a lecture on genocide, probably on the Philosophy Channel. So I'm not going to extend this list. I'm not going to give you a comprehensive account. I'm going to give a very concentrated and demanding lecture on the concept of genocide. So just watch out for that if you're interested, and that'll allow us to just cut this short a little bit. Now, we have just been listing not the content of the conceptualization of genocide, but the concerns that would then animate the content. And so as we move to the actual filling out of the content, it's worth perhaps saying something about the originator of the term, Lemkin. Now, Lemkin is already in conflict with the sorts of concerns I've been putting down for us, because he would have thought that quite certainly the Holocaust was a genocide, that Rwanda was G too. That October 7th was G. That Israel's war on Gaza was G, clearly. And he might well actually think that the Hanukkah Sydney shooting is genocide. And we've got a problem here. Because if you've got a category that brings together a non-state sponsored shooting of innocent people going about festive activities in Sydney, and what the Nazis did, we might have we might have a term that scoops up so much that it can do insufficient work to help anybody. The Genocide Convention itself is very open too. It involves what Putin has been up to, the abduction of children. It involves doing grave mental and physical harm. It involves interrupting the perpetuation of a population by stopping them from having children and so on. These already stand in stark contrast to the more pointed extremity, distinctness, and minimalism I have suggested. So let's try to outline that a little bit, going from the concerns to the substance. Genocide has to involve physical destruction. A consequence of that is that it is a sign of the intellectual unseriousness of our culture that we have a near consensus, at least in certain circles, around the term cultural genocide. I don't believe there is such a thing as cultural genocide, by which I don't mean that there is a sky above us and there sit concepts and we can look up and check what's a thing and what's not a thing. When I say it's not a thing, what I'm saying is that there is no way to construct that concept in a way that makes its cumulative place in our political life a significant net benefit. We have plenty of articulacy already about state-sponsored cultural devastation, and we need to reserve the word genocide for these more extreme, more pointed scenarios. And again, this is something that most serious political philosophers of the past century would agree with, but they would be at a distance from our culture, where just about anybody can go around and say, this is my essay on cultural genocide in that part of the world. You've got a real problem with that kind of genocide if it's a genocide which every victim survives. And then every victim then needs recourse and protection and to be attended to. So this is, I won't make the case further, but this is something that's incompatible with the requirement for physical destruction as part of the construction of the concept. A second requirement for me would be that it has got to be sponsored by a state or a state-like political authority, which is why it's absolutely ludicrous to me, right? Absolutely ludicrous that private citizens or terrorists could engage in G. It's got to have a significant blend of systematicity and verticality. In other words, if you have some kind of utterly shocking dynamic of ethnic cleansing and then a couple of massacres break out, I'm going to be conservative, even though Lemkin certainly wouldn't and the convention wouldn't be. The trouble with the convention, though, is that it is very, very loose on paper. But actually, once you get into a legal process, it is hard to establish genocide. So that's a separate story. We won't get into it now. But I would say that you need a degree of systematicity and a degree of verticality. That does not mean that you ignore what I might call functional intent. It's very important that you could establish functional intent. That simply in virtue of the actions taken by the relative political actors, you can figure out that that's what they were doing. You don't need statements from dictator X saying, I'm going to do a G, here's how I'm going to do it, here I go doing it, and here is me having done it. Right? You don't need that level of cartoonish systematicity and verticality. There can be plenty of functional intent. There is also then an application which really wouldn't be an ingredient of the concept, but it would be a useful sideways bit of elimination onto it, an application of what I call the North Dakota principle. And that is, how would the aggressor feel if the victim population were simply moved to North Dakota, given $50,000 each, given benefits, given accommodation? Would the aggressor say, oh great, that works out really well for us? Or would the aggressor say, God damn it, we want to physically destroy these people, we don't want them being moved away? And it's not the case that it can't be genocide if a party is willing to have that group removed, but it's rather the case that it is an illuminating contrast. Whether the aggressor in one kind of case says, oh, that's delightful, North Dakota, here these guys come. Or whether the aggressor says, no, where's the killing of the victim population coming into your North Dakota plan? Excuse me, we're genocidal here. So, there may be further ingredients, there may be further elaboration of these ingredients, but what I've given is a cartoonish picture, right, of the concerns appropriately animating the construction of the value of genocide. Then I've given a cartoonish picture of the ingredients of the conceptualization of genocide. And before that, I gave you these two paradoxical views, that the concept that must be taken together, the concept needs to be constructed, but that it also needs to partly simply respect the space, respect the lane in which, to a degree, we're stuck with the Genocide Convention. So, what does this mean for particular examples? What does this mean for Israel, Gaza? Is October 7th a G for Lemkin? Easily, yes. Is Israel's action in Gaza a G for Lemkin? Easily. There's no question about it. What about for the convention? Are Israel's actions in Gaza, and by the way, on the basis of everything we've said over all of these minutes together, I'm going to assume, without arguing, that it follows that Israel engaged in ethnic cleansing in Gaza, whatever else is true, right? It is Israel's action a G according to the convention? Well, there are going to have to be two answers. One answer has to be, I don't know, because this is a procedural question. And so up to a point, the answer is whatever is procedurally generated. But if you take the convention as a political cultural construction that we anyway use in discourse, I would lean to say yes. I would lean to say that the actions of Israel in Gaza, if one applies the construction of the convention, meet the criteria sufficiently. Do Israel's actions meet the construction I recommend, focusing on the concerns involved and focusing on the few ingredients of the construction itself that I mentioned? No, they don't. Do the actions of the Chinese appalling actions of the Chinese against the Uyghurs meet the criteria? No. Does Russia's war on Ukraine meet the criteria? No, it doesn't. Does Rwanda? Yes. What are the ways in which each of the three come closest to meeting my criteria? Well, I think what is astonishing about the shocking crimes of the Chinese government is that they chase folks around the world. There's a history, evidence of Uyghurs being chased around the world. So that does go quite a long way toward meeting the North Dakota test. At the same time, there is also this concentrated focus on cultural elimination there. Right? This is not a group we want to perpetuate. And this is not a group we want to perpetuate wherever they are. What there isn't is a large-scale emphasis on physical destructiveness. With Israel, Gaza, the way Israel comes closest is through extent of the physical destruction of life. Israel is a lot less close on the other ingredients, including the North Dakota test. The Russians come closest in their formulations of Ukrainian identity, because there is such a thing as genocidal rhetoric, and here all three parties practice it. And we've seen plenty of genocidal rhetoric on the part of the Israeli government toward Gazans, Palestinians in Gaza, and Palestinians in general. But there is a very clear genocidal dimension to the justification of war that the Russians offer, right? And that is that ultimately Ukrainians don't exist. It's a very strange kind of colonialism. It's not that these people should be subordinate to us. It's these people just are us. They've forgotten they are us. And because of that, they need to be reminded by force that they're us. But for instance, when, as we speak, Russians drop bombs on, Ukrainians' apartments in the major cities, the point of that is to get the Ukrainian population to turn on one another and to turn on their government. There's a video in the main channel about Putin's sort of winter psyop strategy, which talks about what he wants to get out of hitting civilians and hitting civilian infrastructure. And that's terroristic. It's hitting a population with a view to gaining certain political advantages. But the aim there is not to simply rack up civilian casualties. It's to generate a certain kind of destabilizing political effects. It's a terroristic enterprise that is somewhat in tension with the genocidal explanation of it. So use this, explore this, right? Try to give yourself some healthy habits out of this. It might be that 80% of what I've said is useless to you, but 20% is interesting. Use it, right? Somehow constructively. Meanwhile, we're going to move on to say a few things about the Holocaust, and then we'll say a little bit about anti-Semitism and criticizing Israel. Before we move to adequacy and Israel's adequacy toward the Holocaust, let's just say one final thing about where we've landed on the G word. haven't, Vlad, you got us into an unbelievable amount of trouble now? Because aren't we in a situation where, when asked, did the Russians commit a G in Ukraine and did the Israelis commit a G in Gaza, we say there is one answer according to a construction of the concept that might play a central role, the central role in our culture. But then there is another secondary but really important answer that is tied to the Genocide Convention. And so what is going to be our response when we're asked, is there a genocide there? We say no or yes, depending on our construction. And then we also say no or yes, depending on the convention. And the convention as legal proceduralism, but also in the convention as itself a part of our political cultural discourse. So what are we going to say, yes and no? And the answer, unfortunately, is yes. Because the loss of offering a construction that is equivalent to the convention would be huge and much worse than this double-mindedness. It would generate an incoherent and loose construction, but also simply asphyxiating and annihilating the space for the convention is anyway impossible, but it's also undesirable because we're stuck with it and we should preserve it as much as possible. And so this is a situation, as so often with political concepts, where you want to have your cake and eat it at the same time. That's where we're going to stop and move to the Holocaust. So the Holocaust, basically, when you talk about adequacy to it, means the following thing. Number one, publicly, or at least politically, nobody owns the Holocaust. Privately, your family has been a victim. Sure, your family owns the Holocaust. Publicly, nobody owns the Holocaust. Why is that? Because adequacy to the Holocaust politically is not a card you get. It's about your ongoing actions and your ongoing political culture. And that probably in practice means three things. Number one, are you a polity that stops itself from causing grave destruction of life and human harm needlessly? Are you a polity that is good at minimizing rather than maximizing those intolerant impulses that generated the Holocaust to begin with? And three, do you have a kind of adequate and clean self-transparency about your own history? Or are you completely in the clouds about your history, either via sort of, transferring actual events and figures into postmodernist ciphers into which anything could be inserted, or by telling sort of various grandly false myths? So that means that you cannot just come up in a card-carrying way and say, I have an adequate relationship with the Holocaust because of this or that historical event, or because my people are the central victims of it. Being adequate to the Holocaust in a world in which nobody can own the Holocaust politically means ongoingly being good at something like these three things that I mentioned. So lastly, let's move to anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel. So this is also another demanding one, beautiful community, so let's try. Badoom, badoom, badoom. Three things got to be thrown out there first before we even get to a serious conversation about this. And they're all really three things about prejudice, of which anti-Semitism is an example. It is possible to be heavily prejudiced, including heavily anti-Semitic or Islamophobic, while articulating yourself systematically and calmly. it's possible to write an academic textbook that's anti-Semitic. And indeed, if you think about it, a lot of the worst things human beings have done have been partly inspired by certain kinds of unlovely principle expressed in a cool hour in a cool room. So the prejudice versus non-prejudice distinction, right, doesn't map onto the character of the expression, right? Whether somebody's screaming or whether somebody's calmly articulating something in a lecture at Oxford University. The second thing that's really important to understand about diagnosing prejudice is proximity and proportionality to the conflict. So there is a difference in what a Ukrainian soldier in the trenches might say about Russians. That's still okay, an okay thing to say, and what somebody drinking a sprout milk latte in Vancouver might say. So why is the one okay and the other not? Because it's a question of what do we understand to be a reasonable reaction for a reasonable person, right? Imagine your country's been attacked, you're working in an IT company, and now you're sitting in a trench and you've lost several of your new friends at the front, and it's now year 4 of the war, year 5 of the war, and it's a complete nightmare, and these bloody buggers keep coming and coming and coming. It's virtually proportional to show anything about them. So proximity, right, and proportionality. Now, the third thing that's really important to understand about prejudice, on top of cool hour, cool room, proximity, proportionality, is partiality. So the way we form our commitments to things that matter to us in the world is a process that's deeply infused with our unconscious mind, our history, just the sheer reality of the limitedness of human moral attention. We would break if we in equal measure tended to everything. So when somebody comes out and says, well, you're protesting against Israel, but where were you when you should have been protesting against Assad? The answer is, well, partly there's a difference because we're involved. This is a co-authored, Israel's war in Gaza was a co-authored war with the United States in part. But putting that aside, the point is that it's important that you can ethically ground a particular commitment, and commitment to support or opposition of something, right? Rather than be able to integrate it with everything else in the world. If there are 19 calamities in the world, you might only be engaged with 2 or 3 of them. You don't want the most grotesque inconsistency, but you can't do without partiality because you're human. Okay, so having put these on the table, let's talk about anti-Semitism, which actually takes us back to the Holocaust. Because at the core is the question of whether the Holocaust was special. And the question whether the Holocaust was special goes in 2 directions. Was it special because the perpetrators were special, or was it special because the victims were special? I want to discount as silly the idea that the perpetrators were special, in the sense that you can either view the Holocaust as an extreme version of a human calamity that's got manifested in other contexts, or you can view it as something utterly unique. But if you do that, you have to say that there's a kind of unintelligible monstrousness type quality to the Nazis. And that, I would say, would be a mistake, because while there is so much we don't know about how this happened, actually, there is so much we still can't understand that requires a great deal of interpretation. But what we don't understand isn't actually going to lie in the realm of unintelligibility, because it would be magical thinking to say that these people were somehow monstrous in a way that is not thoroughgoingly intelligible to us. The other side of this is maybe it was unique because the victims were unique. And there are two ways for the victims to be unique. One is that the victims have some kind of property which humans just have a deleterious reaction to. And that, I want to say, is just garbage. Another possibility is that the victims actually have a neutral or positive quality to which humans have a tendency, when things go wrong, to have a pathological negative reaction. I think that's also nonsense. But then we can push this the other way. Are the victims unique because of what's in the minds of the perpetrators? What things to do with the victims are in the minds of the perpetrators? So that would be not the idea that there is some special bad quality to the victims that triggers humans, or there is some neutral or good quality that pathologically triggers humans, but that there is a quality in the human mind, an item in the human mind called anti-Semitism, and sometimes cultural circumstances just trigger it, and then it comes out. And that, unfortunately, is not much less silly than the previous proposals about how there is some item inside the victims that triggers humans, proportionately or pathologically, which is obviously nonsense. This is almost as nonsensical, but unfortunately this is not far away from some very mainstream conceptions of anti-Semitism in our culture. There is some item in the human mind that is then periodically triggered by cultural circumstances. We've got to be very careful about that. And then I want to make a sociological claim about this. The argument that this is the case is often pushed for ideological reasons by people who want to undermine criticism of the State of Israel. I don't want to say that is why this is sustained, but I do want to say this is part of the reasons why this rather silly conception is sustained. What is really going on? Well, what is really going on is that there are certain destructive and aggressive impulses that humans have, expressed constantly, in different ways under different cultural circumstances. And one such expression of these impulses under particular cultural circumstances is to express them in association with thoughts about a particular group, in this case, namely the Jews. That's roughly what anti-Semitism is. It's not any more magical than that. And so this is obviously ludicrously condensed, but how do we diagnose it? Well, outside of politics, we diagnose it by asking, are we witnessing some kind of dispensation of the destructive and aggressive impulses in association with thoughts about the Jews? And if that's what's happening, that's anti-Semitism. The trouble is that that is not possible in politics. Politics is too crude, too surface-based, and too binary to tolerate interpretive judgments about psychic reality of particular individuals. So, as normatively impeccable as the structures I've given you is, it's not quite good enough for politics. We can't do this in politics. This is what you can do at your dinner table. You know, is Ricky anti-Semitic? Well, let's think about this. Is Ricky dispensing destructive and aggressive impulses in association with thoughts about the Jews? In politics, it needs to be much more about particular things that are cool and that are not cool to say. It needs to be much more literal-minded. And this creates a paradox, namely that some things that we would call anti-Semitic in politics actually would fail the psychic anti-Semitic definition. And that a lot of things that pass easily, in fact, the psychic anti-Semitic definition would not be called anti-Semitism in politics. Right. So, in that private psychic sense, this is easier, right? Let's say somebody comes along and says, hey, Vlad, you said Israel has a right to exist, and I disagree. I don't think it does. If that's a statement that goes with these destructive impulses, then it's anti-Semitic. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Does a statement like that have to go with these destructive impulses? No, it doesn't. Literally, somebody could have written a master's thesis about state formation and could have been persuaded that in their view, a lot of states are not legitimate. Israel could be a state they include in that category, as I say, erroneously, but that psychic presence doesn't have to be there. It's a lot more complex in politics. And so in politics, we both have to let go a lot of sort of psychically validated anti-Semitism as not being real anti-Semitism, but we also need to call out as anti-Semitic, unfortunately, some statements that weren't intentionally anti-Semitic, don't meet the psychic criteria. I'm not going to spend more time applying this to particular statements, but I hope this sort of carousel of orientation has been helpful. All right. If you have survived the whole thing, tell me how it was for you and whether it was helpful. And in principle, in a couple of months, we can do round 2. Lots of love, beautiful community, and talk to you soon.